The year was 1888, and the wind across the high plains of Wyoming had a voice of its own. It was a lonesome sound, a ceaseless mourning that scraped against the weathered boards of Arthur McBride's cabin and swept across the vast, empty grasslands that stretched to a horizon jagged with distant, tooth-like mountains. For 2 years, since Martha's passing, that wind had been the only constant conversation in Arthur's life. It spoke of absence, of the hollow space she had left behind, a space so large it seemed to swallow the light from the sky. Arthur was a man carved from the same hard land he worked. His shoulders were broad from swinging an axe and hauling feed, his hands calloused and mapped with the fine lines of labor. Grief had settled into him not as a storm of weeping, but as a quiet, heavy frost. It silvered the edges of his dark hair and lived in the deep-set lines around his eyes. He moved with a purpose that was entirely mechanical, a list of chores that began before sunrise and ended long after the last sliver of light had bled from the sky. He mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, chopped wood, and existed. He did not live, he endured. His daughter, Clara, was a ghost in their small home. At 6 years old, she should have been a whirlwind of questions and laughter, but she was as quiet as the dust motes that danced in the slivers of afternoon sun. She had her mother's pale hair and serious blue eyes, eyes that seemed to hold a sorrow too old for her small frame. The silence that had claimed her father had enveloped her too. She spoke only when necessary, in whispers that felt fragile enough to be broken by a sudden noise. She played with a faceless doll Martha had sewn for her, her games as silent and solemn as a prayer. Arthur watched her, a dull ache constricting his chest. He knew he was failing her. He gave her food, shelter, a physical protection from the harshness of the world. But the core of him, the part a father was supposed to give, had been buried with his wife. Their life was a routine etched in stone. Breakfast was silent, supper was silent. In between, Arthur worked the land, and Clara stayed within sight of the cabin, a small, lonely figure against the immense backdrop of the prairie. The isolation was a fortress Arthur had built around his pain, but he was beginning to realize it was also a prison for his child. He saw the way she looked at the horizon, as if searching for something that was never going to arrive. He saw the way her shoulders hunched, as if carrying a burden that was invisible but immensely heavy. He was a man drowning in stillness, and he was pulling his daughter down with him. One afternoon in late summer, when the heat shimmered above the cured grasses, Arthur was riding the boundary of his property, checking a section of fence near Cottonwood Creek. The air was thick and still, the usual wind having died down to a breathless pause, as if the land itself held its breath. It was this unusual quiet that made him notice the splash of color against the pale stones of the creek bed, a patch of dark red and blue that did not belong to the natural palette of the plains. Dismounting from his horse, he approached with the ingrained caution of a man who lived alone in a wild place. His hand rested near the colt at his hip. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person. A woman lying face down, half in the shallow water, her dark hair fanned out like spilled ink. She was native, dressed in worn but finely beaded buckskin. One of her legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, ugly stain spread from a wound on her side. Arthur's first instinct was a cold, hard knot of refusal. This was trouble. Trouble he did not need, did not want. The nearest town, Bighorn, was a full day's ride, and its citizens held no love for the Cheyenne or the Arapaho, whose ancestral lands this was. To involve himself was to invite judgment, suspicion, and possibly violence. He could ride away, pretend he had never seen her. The coyotes and the unforgiving sun would do the rest. It was the law of the prairie. He stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in on him. The woman did not move. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her back. She was still alive. He thought of Martha, how she had wasted away from the fever, how he had been helpless to stop it. He thought of Clara, alone back at the cabin, her silence a mirror of his own. To leave this woman to die felt like another kind of surrender, another piece of his humanity he would be leaving to bleach under the sun. With a curse that was more a prayer of resignation, he strode forward. He knelt in the cool water, his knees sinking into the soft mud. Gently, he turned her over. Her face was gaunt, her lips cracked and blue. A fever burned in her skin, a dry, dangerous heat. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, dark and clouded with pain and delirium, before sliding shut again. She was young, perhaps no older than Martha had been. He looked around, scanning the empty landscape. There was no one, no tracks but her own, staggering and uneven, leading from the east. She was alone, fleeing what or from whom he couldn't know. The decision, once made, settled in him with a grim finality. He could not leave her. Whatever his heart had become, it was not yet barren enough for that. With a grunt of effort, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. As he lifted her, a faint, pained sound escaped her lips. It was the first human voice, other than his own or Clara's whisper, that he had heard on his land in months. He carried her to his horse, mounted with difficulty, and turned for home, the unconscious woman, a profound and dangerous disruption held tight against him. Clara was on the porch, a small sentinel watching his approach. Her eyes widened as she saw the figure slumped in front of her father. She didn't speak, but a flicker of something fear, or maybe just pure shock, crossed her face. "Go inside, Clara," Arthur said, his voice rough. "Get a blanket. Put the kettle on the stove." The child vanished without a word. Inside, the cabin felt small and cluttered with the woman's presence. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only proper bed besides Clara's small one. The movement jostled her, and her eyes opened again, this time with a sliver of awareness. Fear, stark and raw, flashed in their depths. She tried to push herself up, a weak, desperate movement. "Easy now," Arthur said, keeping his voice low and even. "You're safe here." The words felt foreign on his tongue. Safe. This place hadn't felt safe to him in years. It had only felt empty. The woman stared at him, her gaze darting from his face to the rifle leaning against the wall, then to the closed door. He was a white man, a stranger. To her, he was likely the very definition of danger. Clara appeared at his elbow, holding out a worn woolen blanket. She looked from her father to the woman on the cot, her expression unreadable. Arthur took the blanket and covered the woman, then turned his attention to her injuries. The wound in her side was a nasty gash, inflamed and oozing. Her ankle was swollen and discolored. He was no doctor, but he knew infection and a broken bone when he saw them. For the next few days, a tense and silent routine established itself. Arthur cleaned and dressed the wound with hot water and carbolic soap from his meager medical supplies. He splinted her ankle with 2 flat pieces of kindling and strips of torn flour sack. He spooned broth and water between her cracked lips, forcing her to drink when she was too weak to lift her own head. He did it all with a detached efficiency, a grim focus that kept his own thoughts at bay. He was not helping a person, he was fixing a problem that had landed on his doorstep. But she was a person. During the long nights, as he sat in a chair by the hearth, watching over her while Clara slept, the wall of his detachment began to crumble. In the grip of the fever, she would murmur in her own tongue, her words soft and rhythmic, like a song or a prayer. Sometimes she would cry out, a sharp sound of pain or terror that made Arthur's own heart clench. He saw not just an Indian, a stranger, but a woman in agony, haunted by her own ghosts. Wavina, as he would later learn her name was, fought for her life with a silent, stubborn ferocity. The fever raged for 3 days, and twice Arthur was sure he would lose her. But on the 4th morning, he walked into the cabin after morning chores to find her awake, her eyes clear for the first time. The fever had broken. She was watching him, her gaze no longer clouded by delirium, but sharp with an intelligent, assessing caution. He nodded at her, a gesture that felt awkward and insufficient. "You're looking better." She said nothing, just continued to watch him as he moved about the small room, stoking the fire, preparing a thin gruel of oats. Clara sat at the small table, her head bent over her doll, but Arthur could feel her attention fixed on the woman in the cot. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of grief, but a charged silence, heavy with questions and uncertainties. He brought the bowl of gruel to the cot. Wavina pushed herself up, wincing as her body protested. She took the bowl from him, her fingers brushing his. Her hands were slender, with long, graceful fingers. She ate slowly, deliberately, never taking her eyes off him. When she was finished, she held the empty bowl out to him. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were quiet, raspy from disuse, but her English was clear. Arthur was taken aback. He just nodded again and took the bowl. That single, soft-spoken phrase seemed to alter the very air in the room. It was an acknowledgement, a bridge across the chasm of silence and mistrust that had separated them. Over the next week, Wavina's strength slowly returned. She began to sit up for longer periods, her back straight and proud against the rough-hewn wall. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was in short, functional sentences. But she watched everything. She watched Arthur as he repaired a piece of tack, his large, capable hands moving with surprising deftness. She watched the way he spoke to his horses, a gentleness in his voice that he never used with people. And most of all, she watched Clara. Clara, in turn, watched her back. The child would hover near the edge of the main room, a tiny satellite orbiting this new, strange presence in her world. She would watch as Wavina painstakingly rebraided her long black hair. She would watch as Wavina's fingers moved, mending a tear in her own buckskin dress with a needle Arthur had given her and thread pulled from a worn shirt. There was a quiet intensity to their mutual observation, a silent conversation happening in a language Arthur did not understand. The turning point came one grey afternoon. Arthur was outside splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. He glanced toward the cabin and saw, through the open doorway, Wavina beckoning to Clara. The child hesitated, clutching her faceless doll. Wavina said something soft, too low for him to hear, and patted the floor beside the cot. After a long moment, Clara shuffled forward and sat down, keeping a careful distance. Arthur stopped his work, leaning on the handle of his axe, watching. He saw Wavina pick up a small piece of scrap wood from the kindling box and a knife from the kitchen counter. With slow, careful movements, she began to carve. Clara watched, mesmerized, as a shape began to emerge from the wood. It was a bird, its wings half spread, its head tilted as if listening. Wavina worked with an unhurried grace, her hands seeming to know the spirit of the wood. When she was done, she sanded it smooth with a piece of rough stone from the hearth and held it out to Clara. The little girl looked at the bird, then up at Wavina's face. For the first time since Martha died, a genuine, wondrous smile spread across Clara's face. She reached out and took the small wooden bird, her fingers tracing its smooth curves. "Bird," Clara whispered, the word clear and bright. Wavina smiled back, a soft, tired smile that nonetheless lit up her face. "Yes," she said, 𝑾𝒐𝒴. From his place by the woodpile, Arthur felt something shift inside him, a thawing around the edges of his frozen heart. He had given his daughter a roof and food, but this woman, a stranger he had rescued out of a reluctant sense of duty, had just given her a piece of joy. She had broken through a silence he had long accepted as permanent. That small act of kindness was a seed. In the days that followed, a fragile garden of connection began to grow in the barren soil of their lives. Wavina, though still weak and limping on her splintered ankle, began to take on a role in the household. She taught Clara how to weave rushes from the creek into small baskets. She would hum quiet, haunting melodies as she worked, and Clara would sit beside her, humming along, her small voice a stark contrast to the months of quiet. Wavina started talking more, sharing pieces of her story in fragmented sentences. Her husband had taken a job scouting for the railroad, an act that had ostracized them from their band. They were traveling to a new territory to start over when they were set upon by white traders looking for trouble. Her husband was killed. She had fled, running for days until she collapsed. Listening to her, Arthur felt a pang of shame for his initial suspicion. Her tragedy was not so different from his own. Both of them were survivors, adrift in a world that had taken everything from them. One evening, as a cool autumn wind whistled around the corners of the cabin, Arthur found himself telling her about Martha. He spoke of her laughter, of the garden she had tried to grow in the unforgiving soil, of her dream of having a house full of children. The words came out haltingly at first, then flowed more easily, a river of grief finally allowed to run its course. Wavina listened without interruption, her dark eyes filled with a profound, quiet empathy. When he finished, the silence that fell between them was no longer tense or empty, but comfortable, filled with a shared understanding of loss. "She is still with you," Wavina said softly, gesturing to Clara, who was asleep in her cot, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. "In her." Arthur looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and saw not just the ghost of his wife, but the living, breathing miracle of her. And he saw that the light was starting to come back into her eyes. That light was Wavina's doing. The rhythm of their lives found a new cadence. It was a rhythm of three. Arthur would work the ranch, but his movements were no longer purely mechanical. He found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin, to the smell of stew simmering on the stove, to the sound of Clara's occasional wondrous laughter. Wavina, her ankle healing, moved about the cabin with a quiet grace, her presence a balm on the raw wounds of the house. She brought with her a knowledge of the land that Arthur, for all his years on it, had never possessed. She showed him which roots were good for soup, which leaves could be brewed into a tea to soothe a cough. She was weaving herself into the fabric of their lives, and the tapestry was becoming stronger, more vibrant than it had ever been. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. The first frost had silvered the prairie when Arthur knew he had to make a trip to Bighorn for supplies. They were low on flour, salt, and coffee. He was reluctant to leave Wavina and Clara, but even more reluctant to take them with him. The town was a place of hard stares and harder judgments. "I must go with you," Wavina said, her jaw set with a quiet determination. She had seen his hesitation. "I cannot hide forever, and you should not hide me." He argued, but she was firm. She had a pride and a strength that he had come to admire. And so, with a deep sense of foreboding, they hitched the wagon and made the long journey to town. Clara sat between them, a small, warm presence, looking at the world with new, curious eyes. Bighorn was just as Arthur remembered it. A single, dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, and a livery. The moment they pulled up in front of the store, the town's attention fixed on them like a hawk spotting a mouse. Faces appeared in windows. Men loafing on the porch of the saloon stopped talking and turned to stare. Their gazes were hostile, suspicious, lingering on Wavina with a mixture of contempt and cruel curiosity. Arthur felt a cold anger rise in him. He helped Wavina down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment longer than necessary, a small, defiant gesture of protection. Inside the store, the air was thick with disapproval. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man Arthur had traded with for years, served him with a clipped, cold formality, his eyes constantly flicking toward Wavina, who stood silently by the door, her head held high. The real trouble started as they were loading their supplies. A man stepped out of the saloon, swaggering toward them. It was Garrett Vance, a rancher from a neighboring spread, a man known for his mean streak and his loud, ignorant opinions. He had a few of his equally unsavory hands with him. "Well now, McBride," Vance sneered, his eyes raking over Wavina, "I heard you were keeping company, but I didn't figure it was this kind." "This is none of your concern, Vance," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. He moved to stand slightly in front of Wavina. "Ain't it?" Vance spat a stream of tobacco juice near Wavina's feet. "There's been talk of renegades from the reservation, stealing livestock. Maybe we found one." "She's with me," Arthur said, the words as hard as granite. "She's under my protection. Now back away." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protection? You bring this filth into our town, near our women and children, and you talk about protection." He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the pistol at his belt. "I say we take her to the sheriff. Let him sort it out." The air crackled with tension. The other men with Vance fanned out, their expressions hungry for violence. Arthur's mind raced. He was one man against four. He could see Clara's face, pale with fear, peeking over the edge of the wagon seat. This was what he had been afraid of. The sanctuary he had built was nothing but a fragile shell against the hatred of the world. "I'm telling you for the last time, Vance," Arthur said, his body coiled like a spring. "Get on your horse and ride out." For a long moment, no one moved. The dust motes swirled in the tense silence. Then Vance's eyes met Arthur's, and perhaps he saw something in 𝒂𝒚 resolve he hadn't expected, a willingness to die right there on that dusty street. With a final, contemptuous sneer, Vance shrugged. "Have it your way, McBride," he said, his voice full of menace. "But a man who beds down with savages will get what's coming to him. You mark my words." He and his men turned and sauntered back to the saloon, their laughter echoing behind them. Arthur quickly finished loading the wagon, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. The ride home was silent, but it was a different silence than before. It was the silence of a shared threat, a danger that now bound them together as surely as any vow. He looked at Wavina. Her face was a stoic mask, but he could see the tremor in her hands. He reached across the seat and took one of her hands in his. It was cold. He held it all the way back to the ranch. The threat of Vance's words hung over the following days like a storm cloud on the horizon. Arthur became hyper-vigilant, sleeping with his rifle by his bed, starting at every scrape of a branch against the roof, every howl of the wind. The peace they had found felt fragile, a candle flame flickering in a gale. He saw the same tension in Wavina. She kept Clara close, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The storm broke a week later. It was dusk, the sky bruised with purple and orange. A cold front was moving in, and the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow. Arthur had just finished securing the livestock for the night when he saw them. 4 riders, dark silhouettes against the fading light, coming fast. It was Vance and his men. "Wavina, get inside. Take Clara to the root cellar," he yelled, grabbing his rifle from its pegs by the door. Wavina's eyes met his, wide with fear, but also with a fierce resolve. "No," she said, her voice steady. "We will face them together." She pushed a terrified Clara behind her and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. The riders pulled up just beyond the pool of light from the cabin's window, their faces shadowed and sinister. They were drunk, their voices loud and belligerent. "McBride," Vance bellowed, "we've come for what's ours. The town council decided. That squaw belongs to the reservation authorities. We're a citizens' posse, come to collect her." It was a lie, and they all knew it. There was no town council, no authorities. There was only drunken malice and prejudice looking for an outlet. "You're on my land, Vance," Arthur shouted back, his rifle held steady. "You're not welcome here. Turn around and ride out before you get hurt." "We're not leaving without the savage," one of the other men yelled, and he spurred his horse forward. Arthur fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the rifle echoed across the plains, sharp and definitive. The horse shied violently, nearly unseating its rider. "The next one won't be in the air, Vance," Arthur warned, his voice ringing with a cold fury he hadn't known he possessed. Vance dismounted, pulling his own pistol. "You're a fool, McBride. You'd die for her." "I'd die for my family," Arthur said, and the word felt truer than anything he had ever spoken. He glanced back. Wavina stood in the doorway, poker held like a weapon, her body a shield in front of his daughter. They were a line, a fortress wall of three. Vance and his men started to advance on foot, spreading out to approach from different angles. The situation was spiraling out of control. It was 4 against 1 armed man and a woman with a fireplace tool. The odds were impossible. Then something happened that no one expected. From behind Wavina's legs, a small, terrified figure darted out onto the porch. It was Clara. Her face was streaked with tears, her small body trembling. She looked at the menacing figures advancing on her home, on her father, on the woman who had taught her to smile again. And she screamed. It was not a child's cry of fear. It was a raw, primal sound of pure rage, a sound torn from the deepest parts of her soul. It was the collective anguish of a lost mother, a silent father, and a stolen childhood, all unleashed in one piercing, shattering shriek that cut through the wind and the men's drunken shouts. The effect was electric. Vance and his men stopped dead in their tracks, stunned into silence by the sheer, unexpected force of the sound coming from the tiny child. They stared, mouths agape. In that moment of shocked hesitation, Arthur saw his chance. He wasn't aiming to kill, but to end this. He leveled his rifle and fired again, the bullet thudding into the wooden porch post right beside Vance's head. Splinters flew, and Vance yelped, scrambling backward and falling in the dirt. That broke the spell. The drunken courage evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sober fear. Vance's men looked at their fallen leader, at the determined man with the rifle, at the fierce woman with the iron poker, and at the small child who had just screamed with the fury of a she-bear. This wasn't the easy sport they had imagined. "Let's get out of here," one of them yelled. They scrambled back to their horses, hauling a sputtering Vance up with them. In a clatter of hoofbeats and shouted curses, they galloped away into the darkness, swallowed by the vast, indifferent plains. Silence descended, broken only by the keening of the wind and Clara's ragged sobs. Arthur lowered his rifle, his entire body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He rushed to the porch and swept Clara up into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "It's all right. You're safe. We're all safe." Wavina came and put a hand on his back. Her hand was steady. He looked at her over Clara's head, and in the dim light from the cabin, he saw everything in her eyes: relief, fear, and a deep, abiding gratitude. In that moment, the last of the walls around Arthur's heart came down, washed away by the flood of fierce, protective love he felt for the two people before him. He hadn't just defended his property, he had defended his home. In the quiet aftermath, a new reality settled over them. The violent confrontation had not broken them, it had forged them. The shared danger had burned away all remaining doubt and hesitation, leaving behind a bond as strong and resilient as forged steel. They were no longer 3 separate wounded souls seeking shelter under one roof. They were a family. The first snow fell that night, a soft white blanket that covered the tracks of Vance and his men, purifying the land and muffling the world in a profound peace. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Clara, exhausted by her ordeal, fell asleep in Arthur's arms, her breathing deep and even. He carried her to her cot and tucked her in, kissing her forehead. The wooden bird Wavina had carved for her lay on the pillow beside her head. He turned to find Wavina watching him, her expression soft. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken understanding. "She was so brave," Wavina said quietly. "She learned it from you," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. He walked over to where she stood by the hearth. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. All the unspoken things, the gratitude, the admiration, the deep, growing affection passed between them in that single, simple gesture. He was no longer just the man who had saved her life. And she was no longer just the woman he had rescued. They were two halves of a whole they had built together out of the wreckage of their pasts. Life on the ranch found its true and final rhythm. The winter was hard, but the cabin was a bastion of warmth and light. Clara's voice, once unlocked, now filled the small space with questions, stories, and songs. She followed Wavina everywhere, learning the Cheyenne words for sun and moon, for horse and bird. She was healing, blossoming under the gentle sun of Wavina's care. Arthur healed too. The heavy shroud of his grief began to lift, not vanishing but thinning, allowing the light to filter through. He started to laugh again, a rough, rusty sound at first, but one that grew more frequent and natural. He found joy in simple things. The sight of Wavina and Clara gathering dried herbs, their heads bent close together, the taste of a stew seasoned with wild roots he'd never known existed. The quiet evenings spent together by the fire, sharing stories. The wind no longer sounded like a lament to him, it sounded like a whisper of promise. Wavina, in turn, had found her home. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was replaced by a serene confidence. She belonged here. The land that had almost claimed her had, in the end, given her a new life. She planted a small garden in the spring, in the same spot where Martha's had failed. But under Wavina's knowing hands, using seeds she had carefully saved, green shoots pushed their way through the stubborn soil. One evening in early summer, Arthur stood on the porch, watching as Wavina showed Clara how to gently water the new seedlings. The setting sun cast them in a golden light, their silhouettes blending together. Clara laughed, a pure, happy sound that was now the true music of the ranch. Wavina looked up and saw him watching, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. In that moment, Arthur McBride understood the profound truth of his journey. He had stumbled upon a dying woman in a creek bed and, in an act of reluctant humanity, had brought her into his home. But in saving her, he had done so much more. She had, in turn, rescued him from the silent prison of his grief, and she had given his daughter back her voice, her childhood, her future. He had thought he was offering shelter from the storm, when all along she was the one bringing the life-giving rain to his barren world. He had found more than a survivor. He had found the missing piece of his own soul.